Barack Obama. Two data points here. One is obvious. This is a country in which African Americans make up just 13% of the population. The country elected a black man, and then it re-elected him. False black power. Here's the second point. The Obama administration's racial politics almost certainly harmed racial discourse. By 2016, polls showed race relations had reached their lowest point in nearly a quarter of a century. Huge achievement. Almost everyone would argue, I think, to elect a black man president of the United States, and 8 years later, somehow, Jason contends, race relations are worse, not better. What happened?
Well, President Obama is a politician, first and foremost, and he is a liberal politician who ascribes to identity politics, like many others in his party do. In fact, it's probably been worse today than it was when he was in office, this adherence to identity politics. And that is appealing to various voting blocs, telling them to vote for politicians who look like them, who share their racial or ethnic background, that is a priority when it comes to who you should choose to represent you politically. Appealing to blacks as blacks, women as women, gay people as gay people, not appealing to them as Americans with a common interest. That is identity politics, and that is something that President Obama practiced. And it is a very divisive strategy. It helps you get out your base. It may help you scare people to the polls, rile up voters that you need to support you, but at the end of the day, you end up with a very polarized electorate. And that is what President Obama practiced for 8 years, using his Justice Department to investigate police shootings all over the country, sending his Attorney General, Eric Holder, out to accuse Republicans of suppressing black voters, trying to disenfranchise them, pushing for affirmative action programs, racial preferences, and so forth. These are very racially divisive things to do when you're president, and to use your platform as president to advance these sorts of things. And the result, I think, was a very racially divided electorate.
Donald Trump. You quote in False Black Power, you quote your friend Shelby Steele, a Hoover Fellow here at Stanford. Shelby Steele writes, and you quote, "Perhaps the Obama presidency was the culmination of the age of white guilt. Our new conservative president, that is Trump, rolls his eyes when he's called a racist, and we all know that he isn't one. The jig is up." Close quote. White guilt, tell us why you quote that. White guilt means what? Why did it peak under Obama? Why does Shelby Steele argue that maybe it's evaporating, disappearing under Trump?
Well, I think a lot of white Americans thought that voting for a black president would get this country over a hump. And they reelected him because they weren't done congratulating themselves for electing the first black president. What?
Oh, wait, but you just said something that's profound. It's witty, but that's in other words, to many white voters, the election and then the re-election was about white people. It was about themselves.
Right, and what Obama symbolized. Obama was a symbol. You weren't voting for the man himself necessarily. And again, I hesitate to paint with too broad a brush here, but I think many white Americans saw him as a symbol of progress, and thought we could achieve some sort of post-racial America, which is the ideal. What they were missing is that, and this gets back to the identity politics that the left practices, liberals have no interest in a post-racial society. They may claim that they long for one, but when you want racially gerrymandered voting districts, you don't want a post-racial society. When you want racial preferences in higher education, you don't want a post-racial society. When you name your group Black Lives Matter, you are not practicing post-racialism. The left has no interest in being post-racial. And even though they regularly claim that they do, and I think that's what a lot of people have missed here. If you're a progressive, if you're a liberal, you want to keep race front and center in our national debates. Whether it's relevant to the discussion or not, you want to keep it front and center because you think it works for you politically.
All right. 2 fact sets. One from False Black Power. I'm quoting you. Obama oversaw by far the slowest recovery since World War II. 6 years after the recession officially ended, the jobless rate for blacks was still above 9%, and the jobless rate for black teens surpassed 31%. Yet, Obama's share of the black vote was 95% in 2008 and 93% 4 years later. That's number one. Here's number 2. In 2016, Donald Trump received 8% of the African American vote. The Trump economy is now booming, and black unemployment has fallen to the lowest levels ever recorded, with the result that Donald Trump's support has soared among blacks from the 8% who voted for him to the 9% who now give him positive approval ratings. Obama didn't help and received overwhelming support. Trump, I think what you would argue is Trump got out of the way of the economy. And look who disproportionately benefited, African Americans. And the support for him remains nugatory.
You know, blacks need economic growth more than they need a black president, is the lesson here. Though, of course, the left
But only 9% of them know it.
Well, there's a lot of history here, Peter, and it starts with the history, or the modern day history of the Republican Party and black Americans. Blacks typically vote for Democrats in very large majorities, and they've been doing so for decades. I think partly this has to do with the history of the Republican Party, particularly in the post-civil rights era. And I should really, to clarify that, the history of conservatives, I should say, where conservatives were during the civil rights movement, and particularly, and where Southern Democrats were the ones that became the Dixiecrats. So I think there's a history.
So you
here.
mean the Republican Party's base shifting from the Northeast down to the South? Is that the history? What is the history that?
Well, the conservatives that opposed integration.
Oh, I see this, but.
Where the conservative movement was during the 1950s and 1960s when it came to the issue of integration and ending Jim Crow and the civil rights movement of the 1950s led by Dr. Martin Luther King.
But wouldn't the Democratic Southern barons had far more direct result on keeping prolonging Jim Crow as far long as they possibly could? I'm just trying. So Barry Goldwater opposed Civil Rights Acts on constitutional grounds. Nevertheless,
yes,
is that what you're after?
No. You do have the history of a higher percentage of Republicans
voting for it,
for
even though Barry
the Civil Rights Act than Democrats at the time, and that was largely a regional vote, depending on what part of the country you represented, less so than party. But I'm talking about your sort of John Birch conservative movement.
I see. Okay.
And that history. And I think that there are a lot of black Americans today of a certain age who remember that history and are probably simply lost to the Republican Party as a result. So I think that's one factor here.
So there's something historical and simply generational.
Generational, yes, something generational. The other issue, I think, has to do with the lack of outreach among Republicans to the black community. Republican politicians typically write off this vote. They figure they don't need it to win, and time spent seeking voters you're less likely to get means less time seeking voters you're more likely to get. So you don't see a lot of Republicans in black communities visiting barbershops and community centers. You don't see them advertising on black radio stations or during black television shows and so forth. And that's reflected in blacks not turning out to vote for Republicans. So you have that history also explains those numbers that you see there. I thought Donald Trump had something going for him that a lot of Republicans did not. And that was that he was this public figure prior to being a politician who was quite popular within the black community. Particularly his television show, The Apprentice, had a huge black viewership. And I thought that there was an opportunity there for Donald Trump to go into these communities, speak to these folks, and say, you know, I'm a businessman, I'm a developer, I can tell you why these lots are empty. I can tell you where these jobs have gone. I can tell you why those prices are so expensive at that bodega down the street instead of at the grocery store out in the suburbs. Vote for me, and I can begin to fix the situation for you. And he'd have some credibility with these folks. A couple things went wrong there. One, I think, was his birtherism that turned off lots of blacks, and who will never forgive his efforts to delegitimize the first
Barrack.
black president on those grounds. And secondly, once Donald Trump became a politician, he did the same math that other Republican politicians did, which is, do I need this vote? Can I win without this vote? And how much time should I spend seeking this vote if I don't really need it?
So there's a paradox that occurred to me as I was reading False Black Power, where you write, understandably so, that African Americans have succeeded politically. President of the United States, an African American. But there's an odd way in which, by granting such overwhelming support to one party, they've placed themselves outside the usual competition between the parties for votes.
Exactly.
So Democratic politicians have very little incentive to do anything other than take African Americans for granted. They will get that vote. There's on the margin, there's a question about whether they can drive up the percentage of people, blacks voting, but they'll have the vote. And Republicans, by contrast, have no incentive to do anything other than write them off. They're out. Somehow or other, they're not
taking advantage of the two-party system. The other thing, the other phenomenon you see are more extremist politicians. In other words, the Congressional Black Caucus is among the most liberal, has the most liberal voting record in Congress. So the blacks that do get elected have no reason to make any appeals to the other side. So you're not only giving all your votes to Democrats, you're giving all your votes to the most liberal Democrats. And it's funny because it has come back to haunt, I think, black politicians who want to seek higher office and then need to appeal to not just winning a congressional district, but winning the whole state. And it makes it more difficult to make that transition. And now we're seeing a phenomenon where black politicians who had successfully done this, risen as moderates, now find themselves in a much more progressive Democratic Party.
Cory Booker, Senator Booker.
Kamala Harris, Cory Booker. The Cory Booker that ran Newark, New Jersey is not the Cory Booker running for president. The Kamala Harris, who was a prosecutor out in California for many years before she became a senator, is not the Kamala Harris running for president. Now they're crowded into this progressive lane of the Democratic Party, trying to be more extremists than their previous political careers would suggest that they really are.
What is to be done?